When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Skims or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. We are wrapping up our look into the life and career of William H. Crawford of Georgia with this, part 3 of his Seat at the Table episode. Joined by my special guest, we followed Crawford from the election of 1824 through the rest of his life, then at the end evaluated his career and legacy. Many thanks to my special guest, Dr. Max of the Poor Historians podcast, for joining me for this episode. I greatly enjoyed our conversation about this lesser-known yet influential figure in American presidential history, and he brought great insight into some of the medical issues that Crawford experienced over the years, including, most notably, his illness leading up to the 1824 election. Once you're done with this episode, be sure to check out the Poor Historians podcast wherever you get your podcast. I'll have a link to the Poor Historians podcast on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There, you can also find sources used for this episode, past episodes of the podcast, and learn how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help support the Presidency's podcast. Thanks so much to all of our patrons for your continued support of the podcast. If you're interested in becoming a patron, where you can get access to an ad-free feed of the podcast, along with other perks, just go to patreon.com/presidencies to sign up. If you're not ready to join as a patron yet, there are still other ways that you can help to support the podcast. Leaving a rating and review wherever you get your podcast is a quick and easy way to help spread the word and let folks know why they too should be listening to the Presidency's podcast. With all that said, after this brief message, let's get on to the episode.
Your data is like gold to hackers. They're selling your passwords, bank details, and private messages. McAfee helps stop them. Secure VPN keeps your online activity private. AI-powered text scam detector spots phishing attempts instantly. And with award-winning antivirus, you get top-tier hacker protection. Plus, you'll get up to $2 million in identity theft coverage, all for just $39.99 for your first year. Visit McAfee.com. Cancel anytime. Terms apply.
And meanwhile, while all this is going on, he's trying to recover. He was drawn into a controversy from Georgia with the governor of that state, as well as the congressional delegation, protesting the Monroe administration not acting to aggressively pursue the cession of Cherokee and Creek lands in Georgia and the subsequent migration of the native peoples. In particular, the congressional delegation sent a message in March 1824, which, quote, blamed the government for the refusal of the Indians to migrate, criticized the methods of negotiating with the Indians, and demanded government use of force against the Indians if peaceful removal could not be immediately effected. Not only did this cause Monroe to decide against sending a special message to Congress in which he had expressed support for the Georgian government in the matter, but the president also directed Senator James Barber, the senator from Virginia, to call on Crawford to, quote, read the papers with him related to the matter as Crawford's eyesight was poor due to his illness. Crawford made his disapproval of the message from the Georgia delegation known, but they refused to withdraw their letter, so Monroe submitted it along with his special message. So he's having trouble with folks in Georgia.
Affecting his ability to do the job. And take all the political gamesmanship aside, that I can imagine is going to be a huge barrier.
Yeah. Meanwhile, in December 1823, the incumbent speaker and a Crawford supporter, Philip P. Barber, sought re-election as the speaker against former House Speaker and presidential candidate Henry Clay. Clay, with 139 votes versus 42 for Barber, came out on top. This doesn't seem as important right now. It will be important when it comes to the election of 1824. As 1823 gave way to 1824, the debate continued to heat up over how exactly a presidential candidate should be chosen. Because to that point, in addition to state legislatures putting forward their favorite candidates, the caucus of congressional members came together. They were of the same faction. They nominated their choice of president and vice president. This election cycle, however, without a Federalist challenger and 5 Democratic Republicans vying for the office of chief executive, they weren't necessarily content to let the congressional caucus settle things.
American gladiators.
American gladiators. Exactly. Adams and Jackson supporters came out against the present system, while Calhoun sat on the fence. Clay and Crawford supporters, however, felt that they had nothing to fear from the caucus. They were the insiders. Why would they have a problem with this? And indeed, Crawford enjoyed the support of former presidents Jefferson and Madison, but neither man could actually be convinced to make a public endorsement. Crawford is the choice for succeeding, at least in terms of the Virginia dynasty, but they're not willing to go public like former presidents do nowadays and endorse a certain candidate.
Oh, so that was a thing they just didn't do at the time. Is that what you're saying?
No.
Oh,
they weren't,
interesting.
They weren't supposed to be involved.
Is that refreshing? That'd be interesting in the modern day. I don't know. I'd have to think that one through a little more, but
they wouldn't do it. Crawford's illness also played a factor in terms of delaying the caucus in hopes of a recovery, as well as preventing the Treasury Secretary from personally cultivating relationships with new congressmen and causing some folks to delay in making a firm decision on who to support in order to wait to see what way the political winds would blow for Crawford. So more than any of the other partisans, it was Crawford supporters who worked behind the scenes in shuttle diplomacy to get a caucus to happen on February 14th, as they realized it was the only thing that would keep Crawford in the running at this point. Only 66 Democratic Republicans, which was just over 1/3 of that faction represented in Congress, attended, with 2 proxy votes also being cast. With Martin Van Buren of New York deflecting attempts to postpone the caucus, to no one's surprise, voted for Crawford as its candidate with 64 votes to 2 votes for Adams, 1 for Senator Nathaniel Macon of North Carolina, and 1 for Jackson. Meanwhile, former Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin was chosen as Crawford's running mate with 57 votes. Again, in a reflection of Crawford's Achilles heel as a candidate, of the 66 in attendance, only 3 were from west of the Appalachians. He cannot get support in the West.
They don't like him.
They don't like him. As noted by Mooney, quote, "The caucus nomination certainly seems not to have advanced Crawford in the standings, and it is highly probable that the caucus apologia addressed to the Republicans in the United States was a serious political mistake. The statement was accusing in tone, partisan in approach, and pessimistic in outlook. Not good."
Not good for your political future, I would imagine.
No. But by April 1824, it seems like Crawford had turned a corner in terms of his health, and that month he resumed his attendance at cabinet meetings.
Stopped taking his medicines and probably helped him.
That probably did help. But in that month, Ninian Edwards, who by this point had come out as the author of the AB letters, which had denounced Crawford, he was on his way out of Washington to assume his new post as U.S. Minister to Mexico. He had a letter sent to the House of Representatives, care of Speaker Henry Clay, which, in addition to revealing his authorship of the letters, also, quote, specifically charged that Crawford had mismanaged the national funds, had received a large amount of uncurrent notes from certain banks in partial discharge of their debts to the United States, contrary to a resolution of Congress, had misstated the amount of such notes in a communication to the House, had acted illegally in a variety of instances by making and continuing deposits of public money in certain banks without reporting thereon to Congress, and had withheld information and letters called for by the House.
That's going to be held against him, I would think.
Yeah, it's not a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a good thing when you're trying to run for president. And Monroe feared that, considering that he had just put Edwards forward for a diplomatic post, he would be seen as colluding with Edwards to torpedo Crawford's presidential ambitions. Because Crawford, knowing that half of his cabinet was running for president, had said, I'm not favoring anybody. I'm not going to announce my candidate. So, investigating committee was assembled and Edwards was summoned back to Washington. Unfortunately, in the midst of all of this, late May 1824 brought a relapse of Crawford's illness. And at this point, quote, President Monroe raised the possibility of appointing a temporary replacement for him. So this is not good.
And that is a phenomenon you can see with stroke.
Yeah.
Because if he did have several areas of his brain, I'm just guessing by the constellation of symptoms they said, that had been affected by the stroke, one of the interesting phenomenons is that you can see what we call waxing and waning symptoms. So somebody can appear to recover a lot of their function, but something changes in the future to alter, let's say, their blood pressure, where the brain is no longer getting as much blood flow as it wants. So all those areas of injury are then prone to malfunction more so. That's perhaps why you can see that maybe he seemed to improve without any significant medical intervention, because that's what they had at the time. And you can come and go with stroke symptoms, especially looking at accounts from the Middle Ages. People would recover within 24 hours because that's just sometimes how this works if there is no permanent damage and that area is not re-insulted, that area of the brain.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. And it's just, you read about his life in 1823 and 1824, and between all the attacks he was under, at least one good thing going for him. The committee that was investigating the allegations issued its report in late May and, quote, acquitted Crawford of any evil intentions.
Yeah, got that going for him, which is nice.
So he at least got that, and Edwards would resign his commission as U.S. Minister to Mexico due to the controversy. But Crawford just continued to linger in his diminished state as events carried on around him, and talk circulated, quote, that his, i.e. Crawford's death is now but too probable, and that any event, he can no longer be held up for the presidency. So we think of this and we think, okay, it's got to be done. He can't be a candidate. And at this point, Crawford's supporters kept pushing him through, and they said, Madison in 1813, 1814 had faced some health challenges. He managed to be president. Crawford can do the same thing.
Is this the same committee that eventually elects William Henry Harrison? Are they just really bad at picking their candidates based on this type of criteria?
Probably.
Okay.
But they're saying, it's going to be fine. I mean, Madison was sick during the war. It's going to be okay. Crawford's physicians recommended that he go into the interior of Pennsylvania or New Jersey for the summer rather than traveling to the seacoast. By August 4th, he was well enough to spend an hour talking with Monroe. Then 5 days later, left Washington, D.C., bound for Berkeley Springs, Virginia. He would rest there for about a month before returning to D.C. on September 12th.
Send him out there for the fresh air. I mean, that
exactly.
was at least non-malignant medicine of the day.
Exactly. That the fresh air may not kill you.
Correct. Sometimes the art of medicine, especially then, was like to learn to do as much nothing as possible. Especially, when you're throwing leeches on everybody, sometimes the fresh air is an okay treatment.
Yeah. Now, one of the more potentially disconcerting points during his convalescence comes in the summer of 1824, when a diplomatic document drafted by Adams was before the Senate for consideration, when Crawford asserted that he had not seen it, though the year prior, Crawford had, quote, suggested several detailed alterations, some of which Monroe approved. Now, we have to wonder whether Crawford simply didn't remember the document, or if this was done for political cover as the Senate objected to some of the key points in the document. But upon his return to Washington in September 1824, once more word started to spread about his poor physical condition, although some newspapermen who were allowed to see him reported that his condition continued to improve pointedly and, quote, that in all essentials, Crawford was his former self. Now, In a telling account from one of his supporters, Thomas Cobb noted on December 8th that though, quote, Crawford's cheeks were full and florid and his spirits admirable, the speech impediment remained and gave him considerable trouble with articulation. His imperfect vision was improving. He could read about half a page, and then the letters became indistinct, and he had to stop. His doctors had prohibited his reading. He could easily distinguish those. I know, don't read. Doctor's orders.
That's the old adage, it hurts when I do this. Well, don't do that.
Don't do that. He could easily distinguish those with whom he had been acquainted, but had difficulty recognizing those with whom he seldom saw.
Ooh, it's interesting. That paragraph, that constellation of symptoms does really seem to suggest some stroke sequelae, or that being the word for like the lingering symptoms of an illness. And the inability to recognize people is definitely something that you can see with certain strokes of the brain. But it also, I wonder, and I haven't read ahead at this point, but I wonder, folks who have had significant strokes, which are underlying, they're basically, a stroke is a vascular problem where the blood vessels of the brain are either impeded or they're not working. And so an area of the brain tissue dies and does not function correctly. When you have multiple areas or you have multiple strokes, which it's possible he may have had several strokes, who knows? Yeah. You can start to develop things like dementia and those type of problems, and that could have been seeping in here a little bit, unless it could have been seeping in here to say he's not recognizing some distant folks. But we'll see if there's a pattern of that going forward.
Yeah. And just overall, this is not good for
him
wanting to be president.
Yeah.
He was, however, in a well enough condition to attend a reception in the nation's capital in October 1824 for the Marquis de Lafayette. He also had a bright spot when he learned that the University of Georgia had conferred on him an honorary law degree that August. But his presidential campaign was just stumbling, and his remaining supporters looked for any way possible to revitalize his chances, including tossing over the person who had been chosen as his running mate, Albert Gallatin. When your campaign's not going well, dump the person at the lower part of the ticket.
I thought you were going to say they got him a spot on MTV so he could look cool to the kids.
Rock the vote. Come on, kids.
I do get it, though.
Yeah. Gallatin had been reluctant to have his name in contention to begin with, as we talked about in his episode, and he had only agreed thinking that it would help Crawford, but now he was willing to decline the nomination. Other choices were floated around, including Henry Clay, Martin Van Buren, and Nathan Sanford of New York, but no firm consensus was reached before presidential electors started to be chosen. And this was just, by this point, it was a foregone conclusion. Crawford was not going to be president. Van Buren couldn't even keep things in check in New York State on Crawford's behalf. So if Van Buren couldn't finagle things in New York, this just wasn't going to happen.
The DraftKings odds are pretty low on him winning at this point.
Exactly. And increasingly, there was talk of an alliance between the supporters of Crawford and Clay. And, maybe they could be on the same ticket. Maybe Crawford could be president, Clay could be vice president. Now, given Crawford's health issues, being in the VP slot might position Clay to assume the presidency sooner rather than later. We haven't had a president die yet. It could happen. But this was just really seen as an act of desperation, and most of the energy in it was coming from the Crawford camp. Clay saw a little advantage to this. He was Speaker of the House. He just didn't see that this was going to help him in the slightest. So he ended any speculation. In late October, he was not accepting the vice presidency. He spread the word in private circles that, quote, he thought candidates should neither seek nor agree to compromises and should avoid either giving or receiving promises.
I mean, sure. Why not?
Yeah, why not? And ultimately, Jackson was in the lead in the electoral count with 99 votes, followed by Adams with 84. Crawford came in a distant third with 41. Now, as the Constitution states, the top 3 vote getters would be sent to the House to choose who would be the next president. This meant that Henry Clay, otherwise known as the 4th top vote getter with 37 electoral votes, was out, but he was also in a strong position to decide who the next president was going to be. And I wonder how he felt about that idea of compromise and promises now. But we'll get into that more in Clay's episode. But an interesting point about this, noted by Crawford biographer Mooney, is that in New York, 3 of Clay's electors, as originally chosen by the state legislature, did not cast votes for him. 2 did not show up to vote, and the substitutes voted for Adams, while the 3rd Clay elector cast his ballot for Jackson. Also, one elector who had originally been chosen for Adams shifted his vote to Crawford, which gave him his 41 vote total nationwide. If this shift had not happened, Crawford and Clay would have ended up with 40 electoral votes each, which meant that only Adams and Jackson's names would have been sent to the House. Both of them would have been knocked out. Now, whether this was Van Buren working behind the scenes or just a coincidence, who knows? Crawford's name was sent, but it was unlikely that he was going to get it. And by this point, Clay had already thrown his support behind Adams, so not likely that he's going to get it. But if, as happened in the election of 1800, the balloting dragged on, Crawford could have potentially been kind of that compromise candidate between Adams and Jackson.
The first 2 candidates are going head to head. All right, fine. How about the 3rd guy?
But that didn't happen. Clay throwing his support to Adams meant that he was likely to get the vote in the first ballot. Crawford, in a letter to Jefferson on January 31st, wrote that he felt the questions about his health were to blame for his loss. Specifically, he thought about, and he also mentioned Clay turning to Adams rather than him for an alliance. He thought that was due to his health. This outcome, however, was not a surprise to him, for he wrote to the former president, quote, "I've long known the process that juggles and have been well convinced that he would, according to any calculation of interest that he might make, it is that I expected he would make a different calculation and separate himself from those who are disposed to think well of him and would be disposed under different circumstances to support him. That the die is cast, there can be no doubt." On February 7th, Crawford and his wife Susanna attended the Cooper benefit with President Monroe and his family, Secretary Adams and his family, Speaker Clay, and the Marquis de Lafayette. And 2 days later, on February 9th, the U.S. House of Representatives assembled, and on the first ballot, with 13 state delegations casting their votes for Adams, Adams became the next president-elect. William and Susanna hosted a crowd of folks at their home until 11 that evening in what was described as a, quote, cheerful and gay evening.
At least he seemed to, he had a good time at the end, had some laughs, and made the best of it. Yeah. But it's got to be a bummer, right?
Yeah.
Because some of that stuff is outside of his control. Not only the political gamesmanship, but the health issues. And yeah, he's come a long way in the government. So I'm sure, although he had a good time at that party, bittersweet. Certainly bittersweet.
Yeah. And the next day, a request came from President-elect Adams that Crawford remain in office in his administration as Secretary of the Treasury. Crawford said no.
Yeah, I don't blame him.
Understandable.
Yeah, I don't blame him.
And thus, on March 6, 1825, he left his post at the Treasury Department, and he and his family returned to Georgia. Mooney sums up Crawford's tenure as Treasury Secretary as follows, quote, "It can safely be said that he was a leader in overhauling and reorganizing the government machine. He was an able and intensely honest administrator who expected his subordinates to adhere to a high code of ethical behavior. He was interested in honorably advancing his own and Monroe's reputation, and by continuing and improving the Republican policy of vigilance, he left the Treasury with fewer employees who were doing far more work and a smaller payroll than it had in 1801. So he shrunk government. Not only could Crawford take credit for reducing the principal on the national debt by nearly $37.5 million, but he also worked through a slight reduction of the interest rate, which would save over $275,000 in interest accrual for the remaining debt.
Those amounts are adorable.
I know, right?
But I understand, impactful at the time.
It was a big deal at the time. So he's leaving office. He is still an ill man. He still requires rest and recuperation. So in the middle of March, the Crawfords, along with Senator Thomas Cobb of Georgia, departed from Washington in the Crawfords' carriage to return home. He received several invitations to public dinners in his honor along the way, but he claimed that, quote, the regimen prescribed by his physicians made it inconvenient to eat at any other than a private table. And so he declined these offers. And Senator Cobb noted that, quote, Crawford's friends were distressed by his difficulty of speech, his unsure walk, and his debilitated condition when they saw him on that trip through the Atlantic South.
Yeah, so certainly whether it's at this point stroke that has worsened or other conditions or all of that plus medication side effects, I can imagine he's having a tough time.
Yeah. When he arrived at his home at Woodlawn, quote, he piddled about his orchards, puttered at some agricultural experiments, and busied himself with other chores for the remainder of the spring and early summer. He and his wife Susanna attended senior examinations at the University of Georgia before he traveled to Madison Springs to take the waters in late July. Then in early August, he returned to Athens to be present for the university's commencement exercises, as well as a meeting of the Board of Trustees.
Right, so when you say they attended senior examinations, they like hung out and watched people take tests?
I'm assuming.
And there was nothing to do back then. Absolutely nothing.
No, there was nothing on TV at that time.
It's rough.
Yeah. He finally did resume attending public dinners in the fall, and in the winter he went to, quote, the seacoast for rest. Now, despite his agricultural experiments, Mooney notes that Crawford, during this time and through most of 1826, quote, was physically unable to supervise carefully the activities of his plantation, but he remained active with the University of Georgia. He became a member of the Laws and Discipline Committee in July 1826. Then in 1827, he joined, quote, the Committee on College Buildings, Library, and Apparatus.
Now, I mean, this would have been what, 2 to 3 years into his presidency, if he had been elected, and he might have been in even rougher shape. We've seen what folks look like going into that office and coming out of that office under good circumstances and with good health. And I sure the stress would have contributed poorly to his condition.
Yes, absolutely. But not being president, not being in office, by 1827, it seems like Crawford had attained a state of near recovery, though he would maintain a messy script and, quote unquote, imperfect articulation from that time on, which were the only remaining signs of his previous ill state, and he was never, quote, as active and as strong as he had been before his first affliction. But at least he's getting to the point where he can mostly do normal things.
Yeah, try to enjoy his life as he has it there.
Exactly. And he was well enough in June 1827 to be named as a state superior court judge, which was a post he would retain for the remainder of his life. He won re-election without opposition in 1828, but in 1831, he only won a second full term by a margin of 7 votes in the state legislature. While serving as judge, he licensed 2 young lawyers who would go on to be major political figures on the state, national, and after 1861, Confederate level. Alexander H. Stevens and Robert A. Toombs.
These folks in this era are really bad at retiring.
Yeah.
They're not liable to kick up their feet and just kind of enjoy the sunset of their career and life. Just always he's back on the bench. He's back in elections. It's just incredible.
Yeah. And there was actually talk about him being a top candidate for the U.S. Senate. No. Crawford was actually excited about this. However, the bar of the Northern State Circuit Court expressed their objections to Crawford leaving the bench, though Crawford sought to no avail to guide them to a worthy successor on the bench. And so by the next year, he had given up the idea of returning to the U.S. Senate. They were like, we don't want anybody else. We need you here. In April 1827, Crawford received a visit from Senator Martin Van Buren of New York, who wanted to feel out the former Treasury Secretary about whether he intended to stand as a candidate again in the upcoming presidential election. And if not, who would he pick? Crawford actually expressed a willingness to support Jackson in the next election, but he also made it clear that he objected to Vice President John C. Calhoun being Jackson's successor. Crawford saw his former cabinet colleague as a double dealer who turned his allegiance from Adams to Jackson when it became politically expedient for him. Crawford proposed Senator Nathaniel Macon of North Carolina as a more worthy and acceptable running mate for Jackson. Later that year, however, Crawford himself was put forward by the lower house of the Georgia State Assembly as their choice for vice president. So here we go again.
If he tried to retire, man, they're pushing him back.
Yeah. Crawford, while accepting the nomination, also, quote, indicated that he would not run as a partisan of either Jackson or Adams. But the ghost of the 1824 election just would not stay buried, and on February 4th, 1828, Crawford wrote to Secretary of State Henry Clay to clear the air between them. Having known each other for many years, Crawford asserted that Clay knew him well enough to know that he would never accuse Clay of having made a corrupt bargain with Adams. Indeed, he wrote, quote, "The truth is, I approved of your vote for Mr. Adams when it was given and should have voted as you did between Jackson and Adams. But candor compels me to say that I disapproved of you accepting office from him."
How does that track?
So basically he's saying, yeah, your vote was okay, but when Adams asked you to be his Secretary of State, you should have said no. That seems like a corrupt bargain.
Oh, I see. Okay, now I follow it. That makes sense.
Yeah.
For the propriety and the appearance.
Yeah.
Okay.
So news of this letter to Clay raised the eyebrows of Crawford's remaining supporters, who were increasingly turning their support to Jackson. But Crawford did note in his letter to Clay that he felt the Adams administration had proven itself to be a poor one, and that he felt Clay had doomed his political chances by joining it. Still, longtime Crawford friends, including Nathaniel Macon, started whispering that his, quote, sickness must have weakened Crawford's strong mind, and that Crawford's adversaries in Georgia would use the letter against him and his friends. So, not good.
No.
He also got involved in political advocacy in August 1828 when he served as chairman of a meeting of over 1,000 at the college chapel in Athens, protesting the tariff and advocating for, quote, the state of Georgia to set to work to manufacture what it needed. Now, while Crawford did not actively campaign for his own candidacy for vice president in 1828, he did engage in a letter-writing campaign in opposition to Calhoun's candidacy and expressed his support for Macon. In his support for Macon, he stressed the North Carolinians' nearly 40 years of service to the nation and pulled at the heartstrings that, given his advanced age, this may be the last opportunity to bestow this honor upon this great patriot.
It's a good card to play, I guess.
Yeah, look at the old man. We just need to we need to show our love for him. Macon would live until 1837, by the way.
Okay.
But this didn't work. Calhoun was elected to the vice presidency again in 1828 and served under Jackson. We'll talk more about Calhoun in the future. But Crawford could not stop himself from presidential election intrigue. In February 1830, he sent a letter to Secretary of State Van Buren evaluating his chances of winning in the upcoming presidential election if pitted against Calhoun and Clay, should Jackson decide not to run for a second term. While he would expect Van Buren to gain North Carolina's votes, as well as those of Alabama and Tennessee, he also slipped in that friends were talking about nominating him again for the presidency, Crawford, but that he felt, if he were put forward again, it should be by Van Buren's supporters to indicate his support. So just hint, Van Buren, would you like to nominate me for president again?
Wow.
Yeah. Then at the end of March 1830, Crawford sent a letter to Henry Clay, again sharing his thoughts of how a three-way race between Clay, Calhoun, and Van Buren would go if Jackson did not run for re-election. To Clay, he expressed his pessimism for his chances in 1832 and instead encouraged him to sit out the election. But then, if Clay sits out, who should he support for president? Well, Crawford informed the Kentuckian that some of his friends were talking about nominating him again for president. If Clay might throw his support to Crawford, naturally, Crawford would want to bring him into his cabinet and support him as his successor when he retired from the presidency.
Does that seem like the thing that he was arguing against just a little while ago? Seems like that was a little hypocritical based on the pattern we set out before.
Yeah, same thing.
What are you doing, Crawford? What are you doing?
Yeah. And I'm sure you'll be surprised to know that it doesn't seem that either of them responded to either of these letters. It would also prove to be the end of Clay's friendship with Crawford, though he did opt not to embarrass his former friend by publishing this wild letter. As Clay noted to an associate, quote, "It could only be justified by some public good, and I see none that it would accomplish." So he's done, and he's ended a friendship.
Yeah.
Despite these setbacks, Crawford was finally able to achieve the downfall of his arch nemesis, Vice President John C. Calhoun, with a letter to Senator John Forsyth, Democrat from Georgia, and someone who will get his own seat at the table episode, which was then shared with Jackson on May 12, 1830. In this letter, Crawford violated the gentleman's agreement that to that date had been in place amongst cabinet members to not reveal the details of cabinet deliberation. Crawford shared that Calhoun, as Secretary of War in 1818, had strongly pushed for Jackson to be censured for his invasion of Florida. For the decade or so since, Calhoun had told Jackson that he had defended his actions in the cabinet. But now Jackson knew, and he was not someone who took betrayal well.
No, I don't imagine so. But also, I have to appreciate Crawford's at this point in life. He's like, you know what? I'm going to say what I want. And he is just spilling the tea. And what are the ramifications now? His career is done. And he's going to take some parting shots. And I don't know if petty is the right word, because these are big stakes. But I'm kind of here for it. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
Especially against Jackson. I mean, come on.
Well, and against Calhoun. I mean, if anybody needs to be taken down, Calhoun.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Now, having wrecked Calhoun's career on November 2nd, 1830, Crawford wrote to Calhoun, asserting that he bore no ill will for his loss in the presidential election in 1824.
Love it.
He wrote, quote, "I then verily believed, and I do now believe, that had I been elected, my remains would now be reposing in the National Burial Ground near the eastern branch of the Potomac." So you really get the sense that Crawford is just rubbing this in Calhoun's face. So first of all, since Calhoun hands down won the vice presidency in 1824, he seemed to be saying to Calhoun that the only way Calhoun could have become president was over his dead body. And now that possibility was over. And also it could be read that he could now die happy knowing that Calhoun's political future was destroyed.
Like I said, I'm here for this. I like this.
So Crawford would end his tenure on the University of Georgia Board of Trustees in November 1830 due to a rival state leader having successfully pushed through a bill in the state legislature earlier that year, which would increase the size of the board so that a new majority would be formed aligned with Crawford's rival. Crawford knew that this would bode ill for the college, subjecting it to, quote, political exploitation and religious bigotry. And he would have no part in that.
No longer a bulldog, huh?
No. So now that he was done making Calhoun's life miserable, now that he was no longer occupied with his work with the university, Crawford turned his attention to a letter-writing campaign to call for a constitutional convention to address what he saw as serious issues regarding the federal government's constitutional powers. However, it doesn't seem like anybody else was really as concerned as he was about this, so it gained no traction. He participated in a meeting in Athens in August 1832 and sent a letter to a public dinner on September 22nd expressing his opposition to the tariff and again calling for a constitutional convention. As the causes of nullification and secession were now in the political discourse, Crawford let it be known that, quote, if it were discovered that the number and population of the states disposed to secede was not sufficient for self-protection, he deemed it unwise to separate. It would be better to subject to the evils of the tariff and even a system of internal improvements than to form connection with a foreign state. He also, quote, opposed any unconstitutional or extra-constitutional measures until every measure of redress promised by the Constitution shall have been fruitlessly exhausted. Let us keep ourselves in the right and put our opponents in the wrong. So he was against nullification. He was against secession. Good place to be.
Yeah, I mean, hey, he'll be on the right side of history as things go on, at least as far as that goes.
Yes. So in May 1833, Crawford served as a delegate from Oglethorpe County in a special state convention called to consider a proposal to change, quote, the basis of representation for the state assembly. Though Crawford was defeated in a bid to become president of the convention, he was chosen as one of 27 delegates, quote, appointed by the president to present a plan for the consideration of the convention. Now, this committee's plan was ultimately rejected in favor of putting forward an alternate plan to the public, and Crawford would play an active role in the convention's debates over the proposals. The main point of contention was over whether the basis of representation should be the same as the federal ratio which would include 3/5 of the enslaved individuals in the state, or if only the white population should be considered when it came to representation in the lower house of the state legislature. Crawford argued in favor of the latter. Crawford in early September 1834 had his thoughts on the recent vacancy on the Supreme Court and wrote to President Jackson making some recommendations for possible appointees. He spent September 12th with his daughter Caroline and her family, then on the 13th, traveled to the home of Valentine Merriweather and wrote possibly his last letter that day about the Supreme Court vacancy. Crawford noted that he was not feeling well and got a prescription from a physician, which seemed to help.
Probably full of morphine. It probably did seem to help.
Yeah, seemed to help. The next day, however, while sitting in a chair, Crawford went unconscious and never woke up. He passed away in the early morning hours of September 15th, 1834, at the age of 62, and the cause of death was given as, quote, an affectation of the heart.
Yeah, very well could have been true. Hard to say, obviously without that. But going unconscious suddenly, especially, I also want to say that I'm a little struck by the fact that he was 62. In my head, the way that this story has been painting out, he's like 85 going on 90, medically speaking. So,
yeah.
But, things as they were back then, people lived hard lives. And, there you have it.
Yeah. The next day, he was buried in the Crawford family cemetery at Woodlawn. As described by Mooney, quote, the horizontal marble slab that covers Crawford's grave gives a brief outline of his career and says he was alike independent, energetic, fearless, and able. The slab itself is broken into two almost equal pieces. The burial plot is ill kept, if at all. The iron fence is all but fallen down, and it is nearly impossible to reach the graveyard, which is just west of Crawford, Georgia. So, hasn't been well maintained. Crawford's biographer asserted that, quote, few men played a more prominent role in the political life of the United States from 1807 to 1825 than Crawford, and few of such major importance in any period of American history have been accorded so little attention by historians. Crawford has been all but forgotten by later generations.
Definitely guilty, other than maybe I had heard his name. And until, doing a bit of work and research for this episode and obviously going through the episode with you, I definitely feel I have a much better appreciation. And if you asked me at the beginning of this, who is this gentleman, I would have not had an answer for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a reason for that. Like, Mooney does make the point that his existing papers are scattered across multiple institutions rather than being in a single convenient collection. And so until recently and efforts to digitize these, it would have been hard, if not near impossible, to find all these things and bring them together to really craft a story.
It's almost like you need a historian to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and from Mooney, quote, he, i.e. Crawford, often did not make a copy of outgoing correspondence and was careless about preserving the letters he received. Politicians often revealed their motives and true feelings in correspondence with their wives and families, but not a single letter between Crawford and any member of his large family is known to exist.
That's interesting.
So, and we see, like with other folks, like with Madison, with Jefferson, they carefully kept all of their letters or kept copies of their letters. They tried to keep them organized because they knew posterity, they wanted to be written about, and that's how you do it.
That's one way to encourage a legacy at that time, I can imagine. I, meanwhile, will try to bury every bit of my emails written 20 years ago because I don't even remember what I wrote, but it can't be important to history and society beyond me.
No. It's like we don't need all of the junk mail that is most of our mail nowadays to be remembered by history.
Whichever president's elected in the 2050 whatever cycle, we're going to be looking at those social media posts.
Oh yeah. Now, while I was not able to find out how many people Crawford enslaved at the time of his death, the enslaved individuals were, quote, valued at $16,175 and put in 7 groupings as nearly equal in value as possible, due respect being had to keeping families together in terms of distributing the individuals amongst Crawford's heirs. So that seems like it was probably a fair amount of individuals that he enslaved.
I would think so.
Susanna survived her husband for a few more decades, passing away at the age of either 82 or 83 in 1863 in Athens, Georgia. She is buried beside her husband. Their son, Nathaniel Macon Crawford, the one who was valedictorian of the UGA class of 1829, went on to become a college professor, first at Mercer University, then at Georgetown College, before dying at the age of 60 in 1871. As noted by Mooney, quote, although the parks, squares, circles, and public buildings of Georgia, towns, and cities are replete with plaques, statues, busts, and monuments, Crawford seems to have been completely forgotten until the 1950s, when he was chosen as the 7th Georgian inducted into the Hall of Fame for illustrious Georgians in the state capitol rotunda in Atlanta.
Well,
so didn't leave much of a physical legacy.
No, guess not. I wonder if that was on purpose. Who knows? Or just carelessness, as I think, just inattention to those sort of things.
Yeah.
Possibly people then, I wonder, they might have just been like, this is a lot of work to keep all these documents, etc. And there might have been a point where he hit, especially maybe when he's starting to burn some bridges politically and among some of his prior friends and colleagues. He's just like, I'm done with this.
But Max, that brings us to the end of William Crawford's life and career. So before we dive into our categories, what are your initial thoughts?
So I think I have certainly a better appreciation for everything he's done. I'm going to say that he seems to have led a very storied, if not historically quiet career. There are a lot of interesting progressive things at the same time as there are regressive things in his past. Many politicians of the time, many even thinkers and philosophers of the time also gave that. But there are certainly aspects of his career and sounds like personality and temperament that I would love to see in modern politics that I don't think we see. I think he seems to have been somebody who set out with integrity. And maybe we got a little unspooled towards the end, but who wouldn't? Come on. And, unfortunate health maladies. It's interesting to wonder if his health hadn't dove on him, would he have been elected, or would he have been elected in the subsequent election? It's fun to speculate, but yeah, so I think, he is an interesting guy, probably more deserving of knowing who he is.
Absolutely. And so that takes us into where we start the whole picture round. This round looks at the overall career and character of the cabinet member. And so we can each award 10 points maximum for this category.
Okay. Fair enough. Do I go first or do you go first?
Oh, go right ahead.
Okay. So no half points, right? We're going to stay on the integers.
You can do half points.
Okay. Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
How many decimal places? Just kidding.
Just one.
Looking at the whole picture, I would say I'm sort of between a 6 and 7 on maybe the whole picture. Most of the positive points in my head are for some of the political ideals that at least were aspired to, working in some of the difficult diplomatic situations and making the best of it. I think that you balance that with some of the downsides and certainly some of the things which, again, were historically context for the time. I think I end up at about a 6.5. So I want to say 6.5 in the whole picture on the scale. That's what I'm going to go with.
Yeah.
But I'm curious what you think. I mean, you've got way more background in this.
Well, and that's the thing, like, yes, it is a pretty storied career. So you've got somebody who starts, his political rise. He becomes a senator. He quickly grows to prominence. He grows to be one of those key players. He becomes U.S. Minister to France, comes back, Secretary of War, Secretary of the Treasury for so long, and a presidential contender in 2 elections. But how much did he really achieve? Like and we'll go into the cabinet stuff, but overall, what did he really achieve? And especially like towards the end, he goes into the tailspin, which again, part of that was health, but then also just this desperate bid to try and get any traction to get him back in the political realm.
It's a bad look. It's a bad look for the judges.
It's a bad look. It's a bad look. Now, we can't rank him too low just because he did achieve many great offices. He remained viable and relevant for quite a while. I think I'm going to go with a 6. I'm going to go just a little lower than you.
I'm happy. I'm just in the ballpark with you.
That seems like a good place to be. And so that with a 6 and a 6.5, that gets him to a 12.5 for our first round. So now we go to the go-getter round. This is where we focus in on the impact of the cabinet member during their time in the cabinet. And again, 10 points maximum for each of us.
So within each cabinet.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'll take it as a whole, I understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think I would be a little more generous to him here. So we're not saying, he didn't do the giant oversweeping changes that perhaps he aspired to, but we have some tangible things like his reformation of, was it Treasury?
Mm-hmm.
So he did some things. He consolidated some things. He got more work done with fewer people. He did some reforms, and I'm all for that. So I think I appreciate those things a bit. The on the diplomatic phase, maybe we didn't get full goals accomplished, but I don't know how much that was his fault. But if we're going to look at like kind of where everything was with that, and taking into account when he was dealing with the native populations and that sort of thing, I feel like we got some progress there, even though it was not popular for him at the time. But I like the idea there. So I'm going to say I'll be a little bit more generous. I'll go with a 7 on that. I'll inch him up a little.
And I think I'm going to match your 7.
Yes.
Because in terms of his tenure, and especially like that brief tenure in the War Department, he was still making things happen, really starting to make some reforms that, would ultimately play out. Treasury, of course, he had more time. He was able to completely reorganize stuff, and thinking of all the stuff that he was dealing with and the fact that it seems like he dealt with it well, I think we've got to give him some good credit there. What brings him down for me is he started with this harmonious cabinet, and granted, and like I said, you don't think of the Madison administration as being harmonious until the very end. It's not a word that you use, but he had a good working relationship with folks. But then the presidential bug came and it overtook him. It overtook other cabinet members. He ends up in these knockdown, drag out fights. He ends up disagreeing with the president. That's not a good look. And so I think we've got to take him down a little bit, but it seems like a 7 is a good place. And so with a 7 from both of us, that's 14 for the go-getter round, 26.5 total.
Okay.
But now we get to the hot seat round, which is where we discuss any disgraceful behavior of or actions committed by the cabinet member, but it doesn't have to be during their tenure of office in the cabinet, and we can subtract up to 10 points each.
I was going to ask you, like, if you're really, really bad and scoundrelly, do you get like a higher score, or is it you want is it a golf score, a lower score? So okay, these are subtracted points. So the worse you are, the more points are subtracted.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. So yeah, you mentioned the tailspin at the end. It's a bad look. It's not a great legacy builder. So I think he takes some points off there. We obviously have plenty of the slave background. It's always a big negative in my book. And the supporting of measures to try to undo slavery or try to make it right, at the most general, you can say perhaps part of the heart was in the right place there, but it just was not a realistic thing for me. So that's definitely a big ding. The worst part about the tailspin for me is that you have a guy who at first I'm supporting and really into because of the integrity of the office, and then you have the hypocrisy of like, okay, please give me a presidential nomination and I'll put you in my cabinet, and you're just like, oh man, you could have just hung on through the end to that. So I think a higher score here means we did worse, right?
Yes.
I feel like there are people I can think of much worse than that, but I might notch this up to an 8. I'm going to notch it up to an 8.
That's the thing. There are definitely worse folks. And especially it seems like his work in the cabinet, he was doing right. He was above the board. He wasn't, he would try and get a little here and there, with the deal for Georgia, but it wasn't gross mismanagement or, taking for himself or whatever. But there's also this idea of how much, and especially towards the end, as we were getting closer to 1824, that political ambition started getting in the way of things.
And how much, especially if letters weren't available for his private communications, how much did he just hide that from the public? How much was it a show in some respects to be I'm going to operate with this integrity, but really maybe he was politically very motivated, but able to keep that in secrecy. Maybe that's why. It's very speculative on my part, but it's also possible that maybe he was setting out on the right path before, and then maybe I could be president. That does change people. And so, yeah, it's hard to, I think that's kind of an X factor for me,
Yeah. Also, you mentioned slavery. Of course, there's no quantifying the evil of slavery, but he was definitely involved in it. It sounds like increasingly so as time went on. He enslaved more folks. He used the work of enslaved individuals to benefit himself, his family. That's not good. Also, you have this idea that he broke this gentleman's agreement. What happens in the cabinet stays in the cabinet. Now, to be fair, if Calhoun was saying to Jackson, "Oh no, I supported you," he was kind of breaking it too, but it's taking it to a new level when you say, "Oh no, so-and-so said this in a cabinet meeting."
Mm-hmm.
And that whole, he was willing to do anything to take out John C. Calhoun, which not necessarily, can't really fault him on, but it gets very contentious.
Sure.
And then that whole letter, well, I'm glad I didn't become president. You might have become president if I did, because I would have died. But luckily we didn't have to worry about that, huh?
I do appreciate the parting shot, though. I don't know how to weigh it here, but it's a good parting shot. You got to give a good parting shot.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to go a little, I'm not going to take away quite as many points. I think I'm going to go with a 6.
Okay.
That seems like a good balance. He got 14 points in the go-getter round, and we just removed all of those 14 points. So he is back to a 12.5, but he's got a chance to pick up some more points because now he gets tenure of office. And this is the entire time that a cabinet member served in a full-time capacity. He served in 2 positions, of course, Secretary of War from August 1st, 1815 to October 22nd, 1816, and then as Secretary of the Treasury from October 22nd, 1816 to March 6th, 1825.
Pretty good tenure on the end there.
So we round the number, and so he gets 10 points here. And he gets a couple more points because now we're in our bonus round. Get a bonus point if the cabinet member served in more than one full-time cabinet position.
We did.
He served as Secretary of War and Secretary of the Treasury. Bonus point if they served in a full-time cabinet member in different presidential administrations. He served in 2. So he gets that point. He really wishes that he would have gotten this last bonus point, because the last bonus point is if a cabinet member becomes president. Crawford did not, as much as he tried.
Well, I'd imagine too that all of the tailspin at the end was because he wanted that point. I think that's why he didn't want to be president. He wanted the point on this survey in the future.
He was thinking 200 years down the line, that the seat at the table, I'm not going to get that point.
So.
I've got to manipulate the system, try and work Van Buren and Clay. Come on, we got to do this.
Want the point?
But he ends up with a total of 24.5 points, which is actually pretty good.
Okay.
This is actually, let's look at how that stacks up to some of the others. So in terms of the Madison cabinet, there are a few folks who are ahead of him. James Monroe got 32.5. William Jones got 31.5. Alexander Dallas got 33. Richard Rush got 35. So not as good as those, but he's also not the -4 points that George Campbell ended up with.
Fair enough.
So
Never want to be a George Campbell.
You don't want to be a George Campbell. He was not. But we've got one final question to ask, and points don't matter here. Because, Max, after all I've shared about William Crawford's life and career and what we've discussed, do you think that this cabinet member is notable enough or impactful enough to earn a seat at the table of the Cabinet All-Stars?
Ooh. Well, drawing on my extensive knowledge of medical history, which does not necessarily extend to cabinet seat members as your knowledge would, I still have the impression that if you're considering, I assume for this, the entirety of all the cabinets ever, of all the presidents in the history of the United States, is that fair to say that is where the All-Stars will be drawn from?
Yes. Potentially.
I don't think he's likely in that echelon. I'm guessing. And if you start asking me to name a bunch of cabinet members over the subsequent couple hundred years, I'm gonna fail you. But I have to believe you're going to come across some real heavy hitters, especially given the points that have already been distributed to previous people. I don't think he's probably an all-star. Am I right?
I've gone kind of back and forth on this, but I am kind of leaning with you. And I think it's in part the timing.
Mm-hmm.
If he had come in earlier in the Madison administration, if he had been able to work things out in the Treasury Department or even the War Department earlier in, I think that would have given him more. It seems like Madison was definitely relying on him more. Monroe, even though he had a more impactful office, was able to have more of an impact over his department. It seems like in the entire cabinet, he just didn't have that influence, and it increasingly got less over time as he was aiming for the presidency. Yeah, I think it's got to be a no.
Yeah, I mean, he's a guy you want in your lineup at some point, but he's not your all-star for the baseball team. He's respectable. That's like a 230 when you need him to, maybe better than that. He contributes, and he's worth remembering. It's a baseball card you like to have, but he's not the foil rookie card that everybody's seeking, in my head.
Yeah. So we're sorry, Crawford.
Wait, is he going to hear this?
He may.
Oh.
Who knows?
Sorry, man. I think I was a little harsh on him at the beginning of this episode. I feel bad about it now.
We're sorry, William Crawford. You're just going to have to find another seat. You do not have a seat at this table.
Oof.
Yeah. I would say go back to the University of Georgia. I'm sure they've got a seat for you there. But with that, Max, thank you so much for joining me for this episode and the long and storied career of William Crawford. I hope you've enjoyed this journey. Even though we didn't award him a seat at the table, I think, and I greatly appreciate your expertise being able to share kind of what may have been going on, what may have been some contributing factors to his health issues. And, I think that derailed what could have been a much more successful career.
Definitely could have. And all kinds of things stemming from that illness could have changed his personality too. So maybe his tailspin, I won't say it's not his fault, but it could have also stemmed from that. So, it's, I appreciate it being here, and it's been a really fun exercise. I'm a history guy, even in areas that I am not an expert in. I'll still sit and listen and learn, and I know way more about William Crawford than I did several weeks ago. And something will come up from it, and I get to share it with somebody else. So I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, once you're done with this episode, please check out the Poor Historians podcast. Like I said, I will have a link on the page for this episode at presidenciespodcast.com. So be sure to check that out. I'll also post information on my social media around the release of this episode. So check us out. I'm on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Thank you so much for being here, Max. Thank you so much for our audience for joining us. And until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Hello, this is Gary Chahot welcoming you to check out the French History Podcast. Our main show covers the history of France from the first humans until present. If you liked Mike Duncan's The History of Rome and wanted a similar program covering the land of beauty, culture, and love, we are exactly that. We also host world-renowned scholars who have delivered guest episodes on their specialties, including 18th century pirates, revolutionary booksellers in 20th century Paris, the special friendship between the Marquis de Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson, and numerous others. Learn what you love and listen to the French History Podcast today.